Hello to all of our listeners, and welcome back to The Parent Solution, your one-stop shop for all things educational. Today is a fantastic guest episode. I'm really excited for this one. I have Mr. Ramez with me here today, and for those of you who may be familiar with previous podcast episodes, I was actually on his podcast a little while ago. We had quite the interesting conversation about homeschooling. He is here today to chat with me about my episode, specifically Learning to Forget. And I'm really excited for this conversation. Mr. Ramez, welcome.
Thank you, Miss Kimberly. Really good to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Although, as I remember, I probably just invited myself. But regardless, thank you for having me on your podcast. My name is Ramez Takawi, and my students used to call me Mr. Ramez back when I was a teacher. I was a classroom teacher for 10 years before I retired during COVID and was absorbed into the family business. Now I'm the host of the Legendary Educator podcast. So although I'm no longer in the classroom, I do get to be in the teacher bubble, so to speak. So I am happy for that. And yeah, thanks for having me on to redeem myself after our conversation on my podcast that was explosive. Now, listening back to it, I do believe it was a little bit one-sided of me. So again, thanks for having me on to redeem myself.
I think it's important to have people that are not an echo chamber, that are not going to just say the same things that you're saying for the sake of agreeing with you.
I think the point of disagreement is to build upon each other. I don't always agree with what you say. In all honesty, I've been actually listening to your podcast more and more these days because I feel like it's not that we're disagreeing. We are actually sort of building on top of each other.
Interesting.
I'm going to explain.
Okay.
I'm going to explain, right? I mean, I've been thinking about this since our last, conversation on my podcast. And then I've been listening, more and more to you and then thinking about the things that we're talking about. And then like my own sort of, mindset and mentality, just like you said a moment ago, I'm not for or against anything in particular. I'm the kind of person that is, live and let live. If that's your sort of cup of tea, I mean, I'm all for it. I mean, I may not be a part of it, or I may not condone it in my own home or whatever it is, but hey, I'm all for your choices, for example. And so I've been thinking about like our conversation, and I felt like I was a little bit sort of one-sided, right? Where I was a classroom teacher, formal education, rah, 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 I love the classroom kind of thing. At the same time, I'm like, hey, I mean, if it works, it works, right? If you're a homeschooler and it's working for you, I mean, hallelujah, right? I mean, if you've made the, educated choice and you have all the tools and the knowledge and the experience and you know what to do, you know where to go, you know what to ask, you know how to answer, I mean, dude, power to you. I mean, again, I've been listening to your podcast, especially, I was actually re-listening to this one, Learning to Forget one.
Right. The one that we're here to discuss today.
Exactly. And I realized that our shows together, I'm like your podcast and my Legendary Educator podcast, if you listen to them together, you'd realize that you pose the challenge, you pose the concern, you pose the problem, and I try to solve it. We sort of never discussed this, me and you are not in cahoots or anything, right?
But no, I'm very taken aback. What's going on?
Right?
Who are you? What have you done with Mr. Ramez?
Hey, I think, therefore I am, and I learn and I grow.
Right.
But I mean, seriously, if you listen, for example, to, Learning to Forget, for example, and then you listen to like one or two of my episodes, it basically, it sort of answers these concerns. It sort of answers the challenges of education. Right. And so my podcast, Legendary Educator, is basically a podcast where, I mean, in simple terms, it is professional development.
Yes.
In a broader, a more all-encompassing, it's the space between your education, right? Or like your teacher's college or like MED or like what have you, and the classroom, right?
Right.
I mean, it's everything missing in between. I'm sort of answering the challenges or the questions you're posing. But again, I mean, if you're a parent and you feel like, no, it's lacking, right? Or the classroom is lacking in like 1, 2, 3, and I'm not going to wait until the education system evolves enough for my student, for my kid or my child. I mean, again, if you know what to do.
Right. All the power to you. And I know that this is something that we've talked about before, that I've made clear to you in that rather explosive episode that we did together. And I still, just so you know, I still get people that are telling me that they listen. Actually, I'm meeting with someone today who listened to that episode and was
Mm.
very excited to like talk about things and whatnot with me. And I think that was, yeah, it was homeschooling. I think I don't remember what episode it was. I think it's episode 6 or 7. But I mean, thank you, first of
I
all,
could
for
check for you.
yeah, I know that like first of all, thank you for the platform to speak. And I know that in all of my context of how I come at public schooling versus homeschooling and why I am so pro parental involvement, and in my case, it's more of an extreme sense because I do believe that homeschooling is the better option. But that's never to say, and I make this very clear when I talk to people, that's never to say that it's necessarily the public educators, because I think that most public educators and most teachers go into teaching with a very positive mindset. Like you can't tell me that, again, there's always exceptions, but you can't tell me that people who volunteer to sign up to spend the majority of their working day in a classroom of 30 children or 25 children or 20 kids don't start with good intentions, right?
Hmm.
Don't have good intentions. I would hope, right? I mean, there's always exceptions, like I said, but I would hope that I would think for the most part that that would be something, particularly for the money that they get paid, that would be something you have to want to do, right?
Exactly, but I mean, likewise, I mean, I'm sure parents are also taking their kids out of the classroom and like doing the homeschool thing with good intentions, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
where these two meet are, you've got the good intentions, but do you know what you're doing?
Right.
And so a teacher could have all the passion and the good intentions and the love and the imagination and all that stuff, but again, does he or she know what they're doing in the classroom, right? Are they aware of the changes happening in the society, in the culture, in the education system, where we are not falling behind? And I think the sort of large conclusion of your podcast and your points and your points of view is that the education system, formal education system, whether public or private, by the way, is falling behind. It's not catching up, fast enough with technology,
Mm-hmm.
with mentality, with kids, with the
Mm-hmm.
internet, right? So if you
Right.
listen to my episode that was called The History of Education and Why Teachers Need to Shift Their Mindset, that's what it talks about, right? It talks about why the education system was built in the first place, why it was invented in the first place. It was invented as an answer to factory life, factory work, right? You teach the
Right.
kids some stuff and you send them off to the factory to, work the machines and like all that stuff.
Right.
Social evolution is a very tricky thing, and so in order to understand why our education system is so slow to adapt, you really need to understand sort of how culture evolves. And so
Yeah.
there's two kinds of culture. There is material culture and there's non-material culture, right? And the material culture is the stuff we could see, is the stuff we can touch, is the stuff we can use, such as technology, the internet, fashion, stuff like that. And the non-material culture is the stuff that you can't see. It's the mentality, it's the way of thinking, it's the language, it's the way we think, it's the way we speak, right? And so material
Mm-hmm.
culture evolves much faster than the non-material culture. As an example, if you think back, I mean, I'm going to use this example again. If you think back to the Industrial Revolution, it was a revolution because it was huge. It was an explosion, a social explosion. You've
Yeah.
got all these factories popping up almost, in a historical sense overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Except now you have to think about the people and the mentality. How easy was it for the people who were farmers for thousands of years to adapt and sort of learn this new way of living? I mean, how hard was it for the farmer to actually move into the city and start working at a factory? I mean, as fast as the factories were popping up, I mean, I bet you anything, the people actually adapting to it was super slow, getting used to this whole new life, getting used to this new mentality, getting used to the process of the 9 to 5, getting used to. It was
Right.
a slow evolution. That's the non-material culture revolution. It's a slow revolution. It's a slow evolution.
Right.
Okay, now look at the education system, right? Education system, we have the internet was invented, I think it was 96 or something, right?
94. I
Was it
know.
94?
Yeah, it was 94 because that's when I was born.
Oh,
in
was it? Oh,
1994.
geez.
Uh,
Okay. I'm 94, 95. But I mean, like it was in like households in like 96, 95, 96,
yes,
97,
yes,
right?
that's true. That's true.
And then again, from a historical sense, overnight, everybody had the internet, right? All the
Yeah,
schools had the internet. All my friends had the internet. I had the internet. What was I doing with the internet? Not much. You know what I mean?
yeah,
I was looking up song lyrics, right? I was
yeah.
looking up, like my favorite bands, like video clips of like Metallica songs. That's the most I could do with the internet, right?
Mhm.
And so this material evolution of the internet, which happened, overnight, again, from a historical sense, how long did it take for the people to actually adapt and to learn how to use the internet, including our education system?
Mhm.
Slow as snail, my friend, right? And so this is where you get this gap, right?
Right.
um '06, what was invented?
To be quite honest with you, I was only in grade 6 at the time, so I wouldn't be able to tell you.
The iPhone.
See, I'm an Android user, so that's why I didn't know that one.
Smart, but I mean, iPhones were the first smartphones, right?
Right.
And so forget iPhone, so the smartphone was invented in '06, and then suddenly you had the internet right in the palm of your hand.
Yes.
How long did it take us to actually know what to do with a smartphone? If you think back to the beginning of the internet, teachers would say you can't use the internet. You have to use the books or the
Yep.
library or the encyclopedias.
Yep. You were only allowed to have 2 website sources. That was it. Everything else had to be books, encyclopedias, or dictionaries, or primary sources, right? You had to do interviews and primary sources. I do
Thank
remember
you.
that in school. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Now everything's on the internet. I mean, it took a minute for things to catch up, right?
Mhm.
Again, smartphones. I mean, how often did the teacher say you can't use your phone?
Very
Now
often. Not
exactly
to
right now.
listen to, but very often. Yeah.
I mean, a smartphone is a tool, right? It's a tool
Mhm.
of research, of communication. It's a very functional tool if you're using it the
Yes.
proper way. Absolutely, yeah, I agree with you. All right, how long did it take us or teachers or the education system to like realize and say, okay, yes, you can use your smartphone because that's where all the information is,
Right.
right?
Right.
Now there is a new revolution. Do you know what it is?
I would say, I mean, if we're talking about technology and just kind of where my thoughts are going with this one, I would say that it's teaching people. This is something we really stress, is particularly being an online learning institution, is being able to use technology responsibly. That would be my thoughts of where you're going with this. Am I
That's
wrong?
not, no, 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 no. That's not the revolution. That is the whole all-encompassing evolution of society now, right? Because now society or social evolution is largely based on technology, if you think about it, right?
Yes. Yes.
Farming, factories, internet, all that stuff. We are living in the middle of the AI revolution,
Yes.
right on the cusp of it,
Hmm.
right? And I was listening to the Daily podcast a couple of days ago, and they're talking about how teachers fear AI or what's it called, Chat GPT, right? As
Yes.
a tool for cheating, as a tool for plagiarism, as a tool, whatever. So teachers, I bet you anything, teachers are going to say you can't use
No
Chat
chat
GPT,
GPT. Yep.
right? Right. In a
I'd
couple
bet
of
money
years,
on that one.
I could hear it in my ear. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I could hear it. I bet
Yeah.
you anything in a year or two, it's all going to be about that,
Hmm.
right? So, I mean, again, going back to my point, you've got the material evolution and the non-material evolution. And the material evolution is an overnight thing, right? It's
Hmm.
the invention of a machine. It's the invention of the internet. It's the invention, hey, of the steam engine, right? It's the invention of AI, etc., right?
Hmm.
The way we use it and the way we adapt to it and the way we take control of it and the way we sort of learn how to integrate it into our life, that takes a while, right? and
Right.
and so going back to our point together, this is our mutual point. What is wrong with education, right? What is wrong with education is that it is adapting and it's evolving at a much slower pace than all of these technological breakthroughs we're having almost every day now, right? And so going back to your episode, Learning to Forget, I mean, is it the teacher's duty to teach soft skills? Absolutely it is. Why? Because if they don't, they'd be out of the job,
Right. Yes.
right?
Hmm.
On my episode with you, I said I'm not going to call you a teacher. I'm going to double down on that and say you're not a teacher. I'm not a teacher.
Oh, brother.
I'm not a teacher either. Why? Because think about this. Can I teach a dog Shakespeare?
Probably not.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. He can sit there. He can watch me. His eyes focused on me. I can talk and talk and talk and show slideshows and do everything, right? I can teach
Oh,
him, right? I
okay.
can teach him,
But
right?
he's
I
not
could
gonna
teach him.
understand.
I could teach him all day,
Right.
right?
But he
Is he
shoo, go over his head.
is he learning, right? With a capital L. Is he
Right.
learning,
I see your point. I see your
right?
point. Yeah.
And so if teachers don't adapt, they're going to become obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, there is no such thing as a teacher. If you think, I mean, there's the title of a teacher because we're not going to change that because, I mean, that's what the title is. In theory, there is no such thing as a teacher anymore.
Right.
It's more of a coach, of a mentor, of an instructor, and so forth, right?
Right.
But I mean, if I'm standing there in front of a class and teaching and teaching and teaching and teaching and teaching and teaching all day long about Shakespeare, I'm sure there's better ways like YouTube. I'm sure there's better ways like ChatGPT. I'm sure there's better ways that a kid or a student can open up his phone and say, "Hey Google, how did Romeo and Juliet die?"
When he arrives at her tomb, she appears lifeless, and in his sleep, he kills himself by drinking poison. Moments later,
That's Google answering, by the way, if you can hear that.
Romeo dead, she plunges his sword
Yeah.
into her breast.
Crazy.
Thank you, Google.
Sir, I don't know that I'd be comfortable with that in my house.
Thank you, Google. Right? Yeah.
I don't know that I'd be comfortable with that in my house.
Right. But again, if I ask on the or on one of the episodes on my on my own podcast, I say, I mean, if a teacher is teaching facts and dates and names to his students, he is becoming obsolete. Right? He's becoming obsolete. What we have to teach them is how to think. It's how to understand. It's how to differentiate between false information and then true information. How to understand. And so that's the idea of education. I mean, in a nutshell, really. And if a teacher doesn't adapt to that or understand that or advance themselves in order to become that, they are becoming obsolete in the classroom. And so making your point absolutely correct, where the education system is failing for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and I think I listened to your episode this morning on time management. And I was and that idea of I don't control time, time controls me, right?
That was my favorite line.
and the idea that you need to be conscious with your time, and I'm kind of the pot calling the kettle black here. Because you're right. If you don't place a deadline on yourself, and I'm bad for that because I am so driven, I sometimes place unrealistic deadlines on myself for the simple fact that there's nobody telling me what I have to do, right? Like, I mean, within the realm of reason, there's nobody telling me what I have to do, right?
Right.
So putting those sorts of expectations allows me to make sure that I'm still holding myself responsible, right, for my time. Sometimes, a lot of the time, pun intended, that results in things like overscheduling. It results in things like not getting enough sleep, right? Like that kind of thing. And so I'm becoming better at that, right? I'm all for personal growth and making sure that making sure that I'm always growing as a person, because I think you can always improve. Nobody's perfect.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think time is endless, if you think time is malleable, if you think you're always going to have more time, you are not going to take that time seriously.
Right.
And who's responsible for teaching that to a young person?
Well, I mean,
you're going to say the parent. You're going to say the parents, right? But the parents can also, the parents, here's my thing. The parents can sort of only do so much. I mean, is the responsibility in their lap? Absolutely. They're the parents. It's always a team effort though. Right.
And that's one point that we can definitely agree on, because one of the things that I stress in homeschooling and making sure that you are, or in whatever educational journey your child has, is having support, particularly with homeschooling. Can you homeschool your own child? Well, yes, you can, right? But at certain levels, you are going to have to get help, because not every parent knows how to do grade 10 algebra. Not every parent knows how to do grade 11 calculus, right? And we wouldn't expect such things from people who don't teach that. Like, I certainly don't. I don't teach past a certain level in math. They don't teach past a certain level in science, right?
Right.
You can't expect yourself to know everything. And I stress this particularly in homeschooling, simply because in the public education system, you, for better or for worse, have the support of the system, right? Or the support of the teacher.
Mm,
Ideally, you
mm.
should have the support of the teacher to help your child in their educational journey. And in homeschooling, a lot of that falls to the parent, right? Very easy to do at younger grades, but there's a reason that forest school, for example, only really goes up to grade 2, grade 3, because you can only get away with that for so long before certain academic things become a little bit of a concern, right?
Yes, I agree with you there, but I'm going to take it a step further and say it's not only about the content.
Yes.
I mean, is a parent going to understand how to engage the child in the lesson? Is the parent going to understand how to make the lesson more interesting or more effective or efficient or more related to relevant to the student, right?
Right.
One of the biggest, obviously, issues for any educator, including parents, when they're homeschooling, is classroom management.
Right.
Right? Is the mom or dad or the teacher, are they yelling all day in the classroom? Yes, there's a reason for that. No, that's awesome. Right. And so again, going back to the whole thing at the beginning, I said, I was thinking about your podcast. I was thinking about, our conversation. And is there an issue with a parent becoming an educator? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Again, if they have the tools and the know-how, if they know what you're doing, right? So I created my podcast at the beginning of this project. I started my podcast as a professional development for teachers in the classroom. And then you keep popping in my head. Well,
do I?
Well, Kimberly is not a teacher, but she's an educator, right? And the homeschool parents are not teachers, they're educators, right? And the people doing this and that are not teachers per se, because they're not in the classroom. That's how I define teachers, right? It's a classroom teachers, right? But they're educators, and the same rules apply, and the same standards apply, and the same, ways of doing things in the classroom or the living room apply. If you're making your living room or your basement into the classroom, it's the same rules. It's a classroom management. It is, it is teaching all the soft skills. It's teaching all the content, all the curriculum, this and that, right? And so I was thinking to myself, I'm like, this podcast can actually be beneficial to, Kimberly's folks, all the homeschool folks, because again, it teaches what to do with students or with kids. I mean, regardless if it's 100%. In a classroom or in the backyard or in the basement or the living room, it's still all the same concept. It's all the same, it's all the same sort of ways of doing something.
Right. I mean, I really can't fault you there. That logic definitely makes sense. I will say that even a lot of parents will come to me or express concerns or be in my emails or social media, and the concern is it's not that they can't homeschool their child. It's not that they can't, but they have the ability to, if their child is young enough that they can handle, addition and alphabet and numbers and all that stuff. But it's that they don't have the same sort of relationship as a parent with their child doesn't have the same sort of relationship that an educator does, right? Or a teacher does. Essentially, a teacher starts as a stranger to a student, right? Build a relationship with that student over time. I see this a lot with public school kids in particular, rather than homeschooling children, for reasons we can get to in a second. But public school kids, I find, majority of them, struggle with telling their parents that they are struggling with something. There's this resistance to getting extra help, even though they know they need it, right? Some kids will say, I asked my mom for a tutor, I asked my mom for a teacher, I asked my mom for extra help. And kudos to those parents, because they've raised their children and no sort of traumatic experience has happened, and their children feel comfortable expressing the need for extra help to their parent. But oftentimes, I'm sure you would know this, children want to impress their parents. And so if they admit that they need help with something to their parents, it's a bit of a different relationship, right? And so with an educator, the idea is, or a teacher, classroom teacher, the idea is that this is a professional, someone that is knows what they're talking about, ideally, and that a child is able to go to for help in an academic context, right?
That's interesting. I
That,
think
that kids want to impress their parents, or
no,
that kids feel they can go to teachers for help.
the two. I think in the two cases, in the two scenarios, it all falls down to trust and respect and the relationship and the bond that you form, right?
Oh,
A teacher,
absolutely.
a student is not going to go up to the teacher and say, I need help if they don't trust them. A student is not going to go up to the teacher and say, I don't understand or help me or I need extra this or that if they don't trust them or if they feel that the teacher doesn't care about them, right?
Yes.
It's the same thing. I'm seeing the same thing in the living room where the parent has to put on the hat of the educator. I mean, inside of this classroom, inside of this, living room classroom, mock classroom, a parent is now an educator. A parent is now firm and consistent. A parent is now not mom and dad, right? A parent is the educator, and that is it's a new relationship that they're forming with that kid or that child, right? And
yes, because it's within a different context.
Exactly. And that is going to need a little bit of time to, nurture as much as the teacher is going to need a little bit of time to, nurture a relationship with the stranger.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I'm operating on the assumption, I know what they say about assumptions, but I'm operating on the assumption that all is well and good with the teacher and the student. Obviously, the ideal relationship between a teacher and student, there would be able to be that trust, right? And so when that happens, you have kids who are more willing to say, hey, I need help with something, as opposed to not feeling comfortable talking to mom and dad about it, right?
Unfortunately, I think it's basically more of the same, right? I think you're under the assumption where every teacher has an amazing relationship with a student and that every child has a hard time talking with their parent. I think it's exactly the same ratio. It's the same rate. Really good teachers, as much as I hate to admit it, are not a lot. I mean, it could be their personality, it could be their passion or the lack thereof, or it could be their know-how, right? What am I doing? Like, how do I go into the classroom and do 1, 2, and 3? How do I go into the classroom and build a relationship? How do I go into the classroom and gain respect or demand respect, right? How do I go into the classroom and make the students actually trust me? That needs a lot of effort. Not every teacher, unfortunately, has that, right, or is able to actually get that from their students, right? So I think this and that are a little bit more of the same, or they're two sides of the same coin kind of thing. But I think it's the same sort of ratio, to be honest.
Right. Well, I mean, you would certainly know the classroom better than I do because you've been in it for longer. I know that within a traditional classroom setting, I mean, I have my ideas about ideal education and what the ideal education system would look like. But I think that when it comes down to it, you're right to draw it back to our original point is that your original point of it being that education has not yet caught up to our ever-changing world. Now, I am of the opinion that I was literally just saying this earlier today. I'm of the opinion that if the system is broken through no fault of the teachers or the students, if the system is broken, do you want to wait for it to be fixed? Right, at the cost of your child and your child's education. And I think that's probably something that we can agree on, that the ones who suffer if the system's not working for whatever reason are the kids, are the students.
Agreed.
Right.
I mean, I agree, except two things. It's not broken.
Okay.
It's lagging. It's not
It's
broken where it needs to be fixed. It's
lagging.
lagging where it needs to catch up. Right.
Okay.
And the second thing is, I think, the 12 years of formal education and like all of the teachers you're going to get a handful of the crappiest ones you're going to meet. Right. And fortunately, you're not going to remember them. And you're going to get a handful of the teachers who are going to change your life. Right.
Yep.
And you're going to remember them. Right. So it's more of a, I don't know. You know what I mean? What am I willing to, give up? And what am I willing to accept is the question here.
Right. And so that kind of begs the next question, call it lagging, in terms of technology, in terms of the teaching methodologies, in terms of the the way that we approach education as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the way we educate, because realistically, education is still the factory model of education from the 1800s, and it's not going to help our students, I don't think, in the best way. Call it lagging, and it needs to catch up. Okay, so then the option is you either wait for it to be fixed, or you don't fix it yourself, because that takes massive change. Like, education is one of the largest institutions globally, right?
Mm-hmm.
It takes massive change. So do you wait to do that? My opinion is no, you don't. You do what needs to be done to be able to give your children the best options possible. But what do you say? What do you say to parents or educators, or just, I guess it would be parents? What do you say to parents who are concerned about the content, or the appropriateness, perhaps, of the content that's being taught in schools, specifically certain curriculums, right? Because I know that's a large concern.
It is.
It's not just the lagging of the education system that's causing parents to drive more towards homeschooling or alternative education in general.
Honestly, my focus is on the performance of the educator in the class, or the class living room or whatever. I haven't actually given much attention to the content, because I'm looking at this from a broader perspective of international education, right? So for example,
Right.
I mean, in Canada, we've got an issue, and the States has an issue. I'm sure in the Middle East have an issue, right? And Africa, Asia, Europe have several issues. So, I mean, that's not, or for me at least, that's not a make it or break it. It's not a huge thing on sort of my agenda, right? I'm going to give you an example. When I was teaching in a conservative country. I was teaching in Egypt, right?
Yes.
And of course, conservative, Muslim, religious. We don't talk about evolution. We don't talk about Bruno. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yep. Yep. It makes sense. That makes sense.
We don't talk about religion, politics, sex, a whole bunch of things we don't talk about.
Things that could be considered quote unquote controversial. You don't
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
That is a mentality. I mean, all in its own, right? If me, for example, as like a liberal, open-minded, scientific method, thinking kind of guy, is taking my kids to a traditional school in a conservative country where they don't talk about evolution, guess who's going to be teaching them about evolution?
You.
This guy. Exactly. Right. So I may not agree with 100% of the curriculum, which is crazy. You're never going to agree with 100% of the curriculum. I remember one time I was teaching Flowers for Algernon in grade 9, right? And there's a scene with a guy and a girl doing, it's a PG-13 kind of scene, right?
Of course.
And the mom was up in arms. How dare you? And like, how could they? And like this and that and this and that, right? And the principal was like, this is the curriculum, right? This is what we're teaching. And if you don't like it, go talk to your daughter about what is right, what's appropriate, what is not, yada, 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 right? I think this idea of take it or leave it as is a bit on the extreme side. Again, you're not going to agree with 100% of the curriculum for whatever reason. Right. I think it's up to the parent to fill in the gaps. Right. I did teach a little bit of evolution in like one of my history classes. It was more like this is a theory, but some people believe that there's this and that, right? I'm sure they went back to their parents and said, hey, Mr. Ramos taught us about evolution, right? I'm sure the parents were a little bit upset at me, and they spoke to their kid and said evolution is this or is this, right? So they filled in the gaps. That's what I'm trying to say, right? No one is going to agree with 100% of everything. I mean, that's why you have CNN and you have Fox News. Right? That's why you have, Legendary Educator, right? And The Parent Solution, right? That's why you have, the left and the right. I'm in the center, right? I try to put myself in the center. I mean, I don't agree with a lot of like what the left have to say. I don't agree with a lot of the right have to say. I agree with some things that the left have to say. I agree with some things that the right have to say, right? I think
try to be middle of the road.
Exactly right. The assumption of agreeing with every single thing I mean, a textbook or the education system or a teacher or whatever. I mean, I think this expectation is kind of absurd, where you are just expecting to agree with everything. I think it's up to the parents to say, okay, you were taught this in your class, as a family, as a culture, as Christians, as Muslims, as atheists, as liberals, as conservatives. We don't agree with it. However, it's good to know about it.
Right. And
I'm
so,
not agreeing with you that young children in like KG 1, 2, 3 should be aware of sexuality and like all that stuff. I agree with you there. That's not what I'm saying.
I
Right?
understand that.
However,
Yes. Yes.
is that going to stop the kids from seeing stuff on the screen?
That depends very much on how much you as a parent expose them or allow them to be exposed to that sort of thing. When I was growing up, again, I was born in 94, so like I feel like I say this quite often.
Oh, geez, you're a
not
youngin. You're a
I'm not
youngin.
only, I'm not, I know I'm such a baby. And then I teach kids who they just started school the year I graduated. So,
Right.
put it in perspective. Age is
I
relative,
remember
right?
those days.
But
I
like,
remember those days.
but
Really.
I
Yeah,
grew up
yeah.
in a home where we were very much, I mean, we were taught, this is ironic now that I do what I do. We were very much taught to question everything. We were very much taught to ask questions if something didn't make sense. And we were taught to think through thinking processes and to think concepts, to think through ideas, right? But that wasn't taught in school. That was something that was dinner table conversation. There were certain things that we were not allowed to watch. There were certain things like people say that they grew up watching Family Guy and Simpsons and all that. Like we did not do that, right?
That was
And
me.
that was my parents' personal
That
choice,
was
right?
me.
Like we
Yeah.
sat out of certain things in school because my parents did not agree, and I mean I'm grateful that they didn't. They didn't agree with some of the things that were being promoted or that were being taught, but they had the option, right? They had
Yes.
the option. And so you're right, you're not going to agree with everything 100% of the time, but it's this idea of and I advocate for this as well. If your child is in public school, being informed of what they're teaching, curriculum wise, is to me, that's very important as a parent, right? And just in terms of being able to know what it is that they're learning, because if I'm not okay with something, you might disagree with this. I can see you shaking your head already at this one.
I'm thinking
Parent,
about what you're saying.
right, thought process. The parent is the primary educator. The parent is the first educator that the child has in terms of life skills and like being, learning how to use the washroom and talk to people and whatever, like as a kid before they even go to school. The parent is the primary educator. And I know I said this on the podcast that we did together. It is not the state's job to raise your child. It is yours. And so there are certain things that I think should be, as I say, dinner table conversations rather than school conversations. If they taught things, and I've had this conversation, you mentioned evolution. I've had this conversation with multiple parents because typically people want to know what my stance is on that and how we teach that in STAR students. How do we approach that, right? In homeschooling, and I'm very clear with parents on this, there are certain topics that myself and my teachers will not approach, where the default answer is, you know what, your parents are probably better to talk to you about that than we are, right? Things like perhaps gender ideology, things like transgenderism, things like potentially critical race theory. I had a topic of evolution come up the other day, and because we know the parents and we've had these conversations, we do talk about evolution as a theory, which is realistically what it is in terms of different things of evidence and how things are working, et cetera, et cetera. Your child has to know these things, but they can't be presented as like, this is fact. And that particularly gets touchy when you talk about science, right? And topics of science. So I mean, approaching it with always an eye toward what the parents want their children to be exposed to at a certain age, right? My conversations or my teacher's conversations with our 16-year-old child are very different than the ones we might have with our 11-year-old or our 5-year-old, or right, like just age appropriate development. But that requires, I believe, a more close relationship with the parents that unfortunately the public school system isn't able to do, and that's not the teacher's fault. It's just because you got, like you said in your episode with time management, you got 30 kids. How can you expect to be able to do all of that with every single parent? You can't, because you have your own family, you have your own stuff to do as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I say this all the time, teachers are one of the most underpaid jobs ever in society,
Agreed.
ever,
Yep.
ever. So those are my thoughts. Not sure if you have any insight.
I don't know. I think that's it's broad. It's not a question to be answered. It is more of a discussion to be had.
Right.
I mean, again, it depends. It depends what we're talking about. I mean, are we talking about sexuality? Are we talking about religion? Are we talking about science? Are we talking about, evolution?
Politics.
Are we talking about,
Yeah.
or politics? Are we talking about, right? I mean, again, no one's going to see eye to eye, or, eye to eye on everything,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's impossible. Yes, this is where the parent comes in, or the importance of the parent, where they have to sort of differentiate between, okay, yes, we're with them or we are not with them, right? It doesn't mean we should be sort of, have a blind eye to a topic or something, because again, I mean, and this always goes back to this. If you don't teach it, I guess who will?
Yes.
Google is going to teach it. You know what I mean?
Yep.
I mean, if the teacher doesn't teach it and the parent doesn't teach it, Alexa is going to teach it, right?
Right.
Or YouTube is going to teach it. The kid is going to know.
Right.
And so the difference is, right, are they going to know or sort of discover something from an educated perspective?
Right.
Or are they going to discover it from a completely blank page perspective, and like have them sort of come up with their own thoughts and ideas, which may or may not be a good thing?
Right. At a certain age, I would say that would be okay.
At a certain age,
and with certain topics.
Exactly. My 5-year-old is never going to Google certain topics, right? However, they may see something in a movie, especially, all the Disney movies. I was watching, what's it called? Strange World yesterday with my kids, right?
Right.
I mean, and the boy has a crush on another boy,
Right.
right? Is this something that is going to sort of raise an eyebrow with them? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, right? It's my job. If they have a question about it, if they have an inquiry, if they want an explanation, it's going to come back to me, right?
As it should. You're the parent.
Except at this age, that's not what they're looking for.
Of course not. Of
right?
course not.
So again, one of the things that I stress on is that it is up to the educator, whether it's a teacher or a parent, it is up to the educator to stop teaching information, as weird as that sounds, right? As sort of counterintuitive as that sounds. A teacher or a parent, educator, must stop teaching, right, information, because information is now, or teaching information is now not your job anymore. Now it's the job of Alexa or Google or Siri, right?
Right.
You have to coach the kid or the student or the child in how to analyze, how to dissect, how to differentiate, how to compare and contrast, how to sort of take a piece of information that you get from a textbook or from a movie or from Google or the news, right? Or from anywhere, and then think to yourself, which is what you just said. I love that you guys did that in your family, where you always question everything. Absolutely, right? And you question it. Is this true or is this BS, right? Is the thing on my screen, is it making sense, or is it clickbait that just wants me to click on it for whatever clicks?
Right.
They have to know how to accept information, or how to take information in and sort it.
Right.
That is what they need to be learning. Exactly. That is what they need to be learning, right? But like learning, I mean, who did what when? I mean, honestly speaking, I don't think we're there yet, but I mean, even math, there is going to come a day soon, very, very soon, where you can learn math via ChatGPT or AI.
Oh, I wouldn't doubt if you could do it already.
There you go.
To be honest with you.
Oh, no, absolutely. A teacher's job is becoming obsolete. Again, a teacher's job is becoming obsolete, right? And so if the teacher or the educator isn't going into the classroom or the living room, in your case, they've got this in mind where, no, I'm not supposed to be, teaching information anymore. I need to teach skills, right? I need to teach perspectives. I need to teach, sort of build a person, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a whole bunch of things. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to have an episode on basically that. It's all the skills that a student has to learn in your classroom. Is it always the parents' job responsibility? No, it's the teachers. And it's sometimes the teacher is more than the parent, because the child or the kid, spends more time with the teacher than with the parent.
Right.
I'm going to have a whole list of things that the teacher is going to have to, teach a student, including having perspectives, including how to communicate, including how to present, including how to understand, including how to ask, including how to answer, right? Including how to listen, including how to, all of these things have to happen inside the classroom. They must happen inside the classroom, right? Because again, if you're wasting your time, in 1792, this war happened, and no, dude, no one cares about that anymore, right?
Yes. That's one of the things you have to be really careful with, is perspectives, right? And that's one of the concerns I know as to why a lot of parents are choosing to homeschool, because they don't agree with certain perspectives that are being touted in school.
Oh, it's not about agreeing or disagreeing. It's about having number one, it's about having a perspective. Number two, it is accepting another perspective without being nuts about it. That's the whole thing about
that. I would go so far. That's what I mean about perspective. As to say, yes, it's important to know about them. Teaching the difference between accepting a perspective versus tolerating, respectfully, of course, tolerating a perspective is something I think is really important. And this is a large concern that I will say is, from my experience within the homeschooling world, is this idea of, my child is at this point too young to know the difference between accepting a perspective and making it their own, and imbuing it with their own little thoughts. Maybe that's not a perspective I want them accepting at this point, right? Where, as opposed to tolerating a perspective where you have the critical thinking skills. I gained myself a really, really a really good reputation, I suppose, in teachers college, because I was always rebutting. I was the girl who disagreed with everything. That was my reputation. I love that. College. Nice. Are you surprised?
Nice. Yeah, right. Yeah. Really shocking.
Right? That was something that I always brought up, is like, what other perspectives are we also framing our conversations with, right? And so I know that a lot of parents are uncomfortable with the way those conversations are framed. Not that those conversations are wrong, but just the way that those conversations are framed in public schools. And so that's a large reason why they say, nope, I will just do it myself.
One of the topics I used to teach, and I love teaching, was world religions in my social studies classes. And and of course, in a Muslim conservative country, I had all the parents coming up to me, how dare you teach, Hinduism or like Buddhism or this or that, right? And then I always say, if you know a little bit about Hinduism, it doesn't make you a Hindu. Knowing about something doesn't sort of make you automatically accept it in your heart, right?
No.
If you don't, that makes you ignorant of it.
You're right, but as long as you have the critical thinking skills to say, no, this isn't something that I believe, this is something that I know about, right?
And the key word here is what? Having the critical thinking skills.
Right.
That is, again, that is the responsibility of a teacher to teach their students, right? So that when we do talk about things that are different or, abnormal or controversial or whatever, you've got the skills to analyze it, to think critically. You've got the skills to question and say this or that, right? That's the whole point of my mission, right? That's the whole point of my crusade, right? Is to sort of inform educators and teachers, and now I guess parents, to inform educators the importance of going into the classroom, not focusing completely on the ABCs 1, 2, 3s and the 1973s, right? A lot of focus has to be spent on the skills. A lot of focus has to be spent on the personality, development of the personality, development of the mentality, development of the person as a person, and not just a person as a number or a grade.
Yes, I would agree with you that it's important to teach those things. I think that where we might differ a little bit in our opinions is not necessarily how those things are taught. Well, maybe how those things are taught, but it also who teaches them. One of my big points is that and I said this a little bit earlier, it's definitely important to have other influences, positive influences that you trust, of authority, who are in your child's life, because you can't be the only one that they see as the parent, as the authority, whatever, right? You have to have other people, other adults who you trust, who you know, who are people of integrity and whatnot, who are helping your child to develop in some way, whether that's educationally, socially, mentally, right, in whatever way. And I think that's one of the main reasons that is one of the things that I think is very important to be able to support with your child, right? It's just that schooling in that sense may look a little bit different for different families.
I agree with you there, because if you got the parent teaching everything right all the time, there is the huge risk of bias.
Yes.
Right? A huge risk of bias, right?
And it's also unrealistic.
It's also It's also unrealistic. It is.
Right? Yeah.
It is, and it's not. Again, it is and it's not, right? It's not about the content anymore, right? I can teach, I could probably teach, physics to my student without actually teaching physics. Can I teach a dog Shakespeare? Yes, I can, right? Are they going to learn?
The concepts. Yeah, the learning process.
It's a learning. Now I've got Google, I've got Alexa, I've got YouTube, and now I've got ChatGPT, right? All of these people are not my enemies. On the contrary, they're my friends. Let them deal with the content and the boring stuff, right? And I'm going to focus on, okay, what did you learn? How can we dissect it? How can we analyze it? How can we understand it?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's important. Those are like you said, kind of like two sides of the same coin. I was quite surprised.
I don't feel right. I think we're agreeing too much. I mean, we're agreeing too much today. Something's off. Something's
this is a little weird. Let's reshoot this one, shall we?
I think there's an eclipse or something.
But I think, but this is the idea, right? Is I know we were talking at the beginning of this podcast about not having people, and I make it a point, as uncomfortable as it is, I make it a point to practice what I preach. And being a person of integrity, I want to make sure that I hold to what I'm saying. So if I say you have to have people who aren't always gonna, you can't live in an echo chamber. You have to have people who are going to challenge you.
Yes.
Well, that's what I mean, because there are people that I meet almost on a daily basis who I don't necessarily see eye to eye with them on everything. But guess what? That's okay. We can still have respectful discussion and engagement and talk as we are now. And look, we can find commonalities that I believe are the important commonalities to like with what we're saying, right? In terms of how to go about
yes,
them.
I agree with you there. Absolutely. However, what is the danger of a young person who isn't taught how to have a civil conversation with somebody they disagree with?
What's the danger of that?
What's the risk of that, right? And I'm saying this because, again, if the parent is not careful, or the teacher or the system or the education system. And again, I'm saying the whole education system because I know I taught in a conservative country who are very sort of one-sided on like several topics, right?
Yeah.
What if you're not taught how to have a conversation? I mean, what if you're not taught that skill of disagreeing? Yes.
And disagreeing respectfully, I might add.
Exactly.
That's very important.
Right. I think that is risky in a homeschooling environment. I also think this is risky in a conservative environment as well, whether it's a country or a region or whatever, right? Where we're not teaching the other side of the fence, where we're not teaching the other side of the coin, we're not teaching the other side. We're only focused, on the yeah, rah, rah, rah. And we're not giving an opportunity to actually disagree. I mean, I'm saying this because I saw the effects of this when I was teaching something I wasn't supposed to.
Right.
Or I was teaching something that was borderline, I'm not gonna say banned, but
not approved of.
Yeah. Right. I mean, if the administration were actually aware of what I was teaching, they would have been no. Right.
Right. And so that's something that I think is really important too. And that's something that I stress, right? Both, within life, but also within the students that we serve. And I'm very open with parents about that. that it is important to be able to teach your child about certain concepts and certain things that they may not agree with, because they need to know where they stand on those issues. Because to your point earlier, if you don't bring it up, somebody else will. And certain sensitive topics, like the Lord forbid that somebody finds something out in a certain way that you as the parent didn't want them finding out about, or they get taken advantage of in a certain situation because you didn't educate them in a certain way, about potentially the dangers, right? This is why I believe it's important to protect your children, but also to educate. Like, protecting them doesn't mean shielding them from
Yes.
all of the information that is out there. It means age appropriate stages of information. Like I said, a conversation with your 16-year-old child might be much different from the one you have with your 11-year-old or your 5-year-old or your 3-year-old. Age appropriate conversations, I think, are important.
Yes, but I mean, here's the thing. I mean, looking back to like when I was a kid, for example, you know, in the 90s, I mean, if we wanted to see something, look at something, discover something that was inappropriate, we had to work hard for it.
Yes,
you know,
very true. Now it's at
you
your
know what I
fingertips.
mean?
Yes.
You know, it was a lot of hard work, right? It wasn't as easy as it was today. I remember looking at the encyclopedia, for example. Oh my, you know, what's it, right? But nowadays, with these kids, you know, being born with a tablet in their hands, it's not a matter of looking for something. It's a matter of stumbling upon something so easily.
Yeah. Yes, because information is so accessible.
It's so accessible, and they don't always know what they're looking for, and they don't always know what they're looking at, and they don't always know, you know, sort of what's on their screen until it's too late.
Right.
We worked hard, like, to find something that was wrong. They are stumbling upon it accidentally, and so very, very, very easily and simply, right? And so I think teaching skills, you know, nowadays especially, is so much more important to this current generation than it was to our generation, because we were still, you know, we're still the textbook generation where we had to be taught actual information, right? But I mean, nowadays, no, information is literally in the palm of your hand. Actually, not even. It's with Google.
It's with Alexa. The sound of your voice.
It's sound of a voice. You know, hey Google, how far is Earth from the sun?
Earth is currently 152,100,000 kilometers from the sun. It follows an elliptical orbit, and the distance is constantly changing.
The astronomy teacher is now obsolete.
Right. And so that's one thing that, you know, among many other things we've talked about today, that's one thing that I think we can agree on, is that information, it's not about the school, and education and learning is not about the knowing of information. It's about the knowledge of how to utilize information, right?
Yeah.
And if you're really lucky, you'll get to utilize such information in a way that benefits you in terms of a career, in terms of connections, in terms of your future. That's really where I think we should be focusing in terms of education. And to your original point of the podcast, of why we were originally talking today, my goodness, we got a little off track. Education is just lagging a little bit behind, right? I'm just a little more radical in the sense that I'm like, don't wait for it to be fixed.
Right, exactly. That's what I was going to say. I think you and I actually agree more than you think. I think we're both sort of different sides of the same coin, except my solution is to try to educate teachers, is to try to inform teachers, you know, help them, you know, change their mindset, help them change their perspective on you know, education, right? Instead of going into the classroom and sort of lecture what's in the textbook, they should be doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? You, on the other hand, like you said, a little bit more extreme, off with their head, you know.
Well,
bomb the schools, you know what I mean?
But you have to admit there's a certain sense in that, right? And that's not blaming anybody necessarily. I mean, if I were to blame someone, I know exactly, I know the organization at which I would place the blame, not an individual, right?
Right. But again, I think we agree more than we actually disagree. The only thing that we may or may not disagree with is the outcome. Again, I said, you know, if you want to homeschool your kid, I mean, have at it, right?
If that's
Right?
what's
If you have,
working, if you've got the
if you
support,
have,
you know what you're doing.
if you know what you're doing,
Wait,
if it's an
hang on.
educated
I need to
decision.
make sure. Is this recording?
Is
Yes,
this
we're
recording? Yeah. You hit
We're
record,
good.
right? I mean, again,
Yes,
if
we're
it's
recording.
not a rash decision, if it's not a decision made out of passion, right? If it's not a
Right.
decision made out of hate, if it's not a decision made out of extreme, sort of extreme emotions, you know, an extreme way of thinking or whatever. I mean, it's an educated decision where you've done your homework, you've taken some training, right?
Right.
You've
Or
listened to my
you've gotten the
podcast. You've
resources.
listened to my podcast, for example, and you know, right, and you know what
Right.
to do with your kids, right? You know what you're doing. It's not like, okay, here's the textbook, or now what do I do, right?
Right.
No, you've
Sit
got a
down at
plan.
the table, we're going to work through this textbook together. That's not how homeschooling should work. Ever.
Exactly,
Ever.
right? So you should go in with a plan, with a mentality, with support. I think you should think a million times before you make this decision. And then if you still come to the same conclusion, then yes, go for it.
Right. But I would agree with you, because that's much what I say as well, right? It's not a decision to be taken lightly.
Exactly.
It is something you want to have the support. And I very much stress that. I literally just did a blog and a podcast the other week about finding your tribe, about the importance of support. Always preaching about the importance of support, of resources, of curriculum that suits your needs, right? And of having realistically people, because you can't do it alone. You can't.
Exactly.
And that's one thing that I know we agree on it. Whatever your educational journey is, you have to be able to do it in tandem with, or in partnership with, resources and support and other people.
Exactly.
In some sense.
So hey, it looks like we're friends. We're friends after all.
This feels so weird. It's been a pleasure, Ramez. Thank you very much, Mr. Ramez, for coming on and for talking. I must admit, I'm pleasantly surprised.
I felt like when I had you on my podcast, there was a risk of being taken the wrong way, and like maybe I went into it with more of a villainous perspective, right? Like demonizing, you know, this thing. What is this thing? You know, homeschool. You know, we have a school system for that, right? But you know, thankfully, I thought through it. You know, I thought about it. I listened to your podcast. You know, several episodes, and I thought critically. Right.
You use those critical thinking skills.
I compared and I contrasted. I analyzed, right? And then I came to the conclusion that why not? Right? If it works, it works. Right? There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, again, this system has the pros and the cons, and this system has the pros and the cons, and it's up to the parent essentially to say, okay, what am I going to sort of sacrifice for what?
Yes.
Is what I wanted to say.
Yeah. And that's the question that it comes down to. Thank you so much, Mr. Ramez. Tell our listeners, before we close out this episode, tell our listeners where they can find you, what sorts of things that you have to offer as well, and where they might be able to locate you on the internet.
My podcast is called Legendary Educator. I'm currently running a summer professional development series on the podcast. It starts in July and goes all the way until the end of August. It's basically 9 episodes of pure professional development. So I'm going to cover things like classroom management. I'm going to tell you what to do on the very first day of school. I'm going to talk about active learning, differentiation, the hidden curriculum, and a whole bunch of things basically to prepare teachers or educators for back to school next September. You could find it on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, anywhere that plays podcasts. My website is legendaryeducator.com, at Legendary Educator on Instagram, at Legendary Educator on Facebook. And if you want to get in touch with me directly, it's Ramez at Legendary Educator, or RAMEZ at Legendary Educator.
And of course, for those of you who are familiar with the format of the Parent Solution, you know that as of the drop date of this podcast, there is a partner blog that's been published as well. That is on our website. That has all of Mr. Ramez's links and information in that blog post as well. So if you're wanting everything in one area, you can head over to www.starstudents.co. Thank you very much for recording with me. I really appreciate your time and your energy and your attention. I know it's late there for you, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, and I do look forward to our next conversation on my podcast. Now it's my turn, so I'll be having you on my podcast for season 2 this fall.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ramez, for showing up today. This was a great conversation. A pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much. Really good to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.